Yeah.
Thanks. Julian Kwan, Natural Resource Institute, University of Greenwich. I'd like to comment really on both presentations and see if both Ruth and Colin have any responses to make, because they were both fascinating papers. And Andrew, if you can tolerate a short intervention, I'll try and be brief, but shut me up if I'm not. It seems to me that there's a background of incredible faith in Africa in the combination of investment, what donors can do, and technology. And I'm kind of wondering if there's a little bit of an elephant in the room here where we're talking about political economy of African agricultural development, which is the AR4D industry, if you like, agricultural research for development, and the technology push, which is undoubtedly linked to a whole set of global interests and involves very close to the shift into promoting the shift, a dramatic shift into commercial farming, which is also linked to national governmental and elite interests. And the fact that I'm sure Colin's aware of from his work in Malawi and the recent collection of papers that was published in a recent issue of Food Policy, which is drawing together evidence which really suggests that the scale and the pace and the outcomes, the impact of this push, technology-led push to commercial farming, is really extremely limited in Africa, and that large numbers of small producers, large numbers of women, the kinds of peasant or farming households that are basically hanging in there, not very productively, and not really being picked up by this. Now, Colin pointed very rightly to the problems with extension, and Ruth pointed to the problems not just with large-scale land investment, but with, if you like, small, medium-scale, local elites, urban farmers, emerging middle class, etc. And we seem to be in a position where huge numbers of people are just being left behind. So I'm wondering really to what extent the political economy analysis ought to extend to the network of global and national relationships which underpin this, and also look at whether the technology-based solutions that are being promoted are really going to work, to what extent they can work for the majority of poor and marginal small farmers in Africa, and what that means for transformation in the end. And the threats to land relations, for example, are huge, and the conflict-related risks. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, Sheila, and then maybe over here.
Thank you, Sheila Page, ODI. I found the second paper a refutation of the first. I mean, so it certainly supported the two questions I wanted to ask Colin, which is why. I mean, I see the arguments in a case like Rwanda, where the 10% target creates a very useful reinforcement or outward and visible sign of what a government wanted to do anyway, and that is sensible. But it is a political number. It isn't based on someone working out that you need precisely 10, that 9.9 isn't enough and 10.1 is too much. So I do not understand this. First, why you put so much emphasis on the fact that people keep supporting it. Of course they do. People have supported 0.7% for aid for, 40 years now. That doesn't mean anything until you actually get an individual government committing it to it. But summits mean nothing. So that's the first question. The second one is why you want people to waste time trying to measure it. Because what we know is that the moment you try to devise a statistic that meets a target, it's the statistics that will suffer, it's the statistics that will be fudged. Yes, every country will manage to prove it's doing 10%, but its statistics will be even worse than, as Steve pointed out, they are at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much. Colin's paper was very, very informative, and one is very glad that they are highlighting some of the challenges we face in Africa. There are two basic aspects I would like us to look at. Maybe he has some insights into. One is the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda for Action, which both have expectations: leadership of program implementation, accountability, and governance, vis-a-vis the internal donor expectations. because in program evaluation, we found that quite often implementers are a little bit confused. Here they have the Paris Declaration, on the other hand, where they should provide leadership. On the other hand, they have donor expectations, conditionalities, demands for new institutional framework for policies and programs of implementation. Secondly, I think we'll have to look at the long process of ratification of all the agreements. The heads of states, they go to conferences, summits. Sometimes to save their face, they sign these documents. But coming home, for Parliament to ratify them for implementation is very, very problematic. Again, we have long land reform processes. These are the expectations to implement agricultural programs. So these are some of the problems we have if you are going to look at agri governance issues on the whole and successes to program implementation. Thank you very much.
Yes, gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name is Ibrahim Yahuza. I'm a crop scientist. I'm not so good in policy issues, but I'm interested in organic farming. And one thing that kept coming up always is that organic farming in Africa is not well developed, and it's largely due to policy issues. And from what I can understand is that organic farming is divided basically into two. We have certified and uncertified organic farming system. And but basically they provide similar things to the environment, and all they provide similar benefits. And what happens is that substantial percent of farming in Africa is uncertified, either due to lack of access to technologies, modern technologies for what I can call conventional farming system, or simply lack of fund or something like that. So do you think, rather than government of African countries pursuing policies that will target conventional or what I can call modern farming system, it is rather better to start pursuing organic farming, policies that will make organic farming system in Africa grow, because inherently, as I said, that organic farming system in Africa, there doesn't seem to be much dramatic difference between the traditional farming system with organic farming, certified organic farming, but there appears to be lack of policies to enable farmers access certified organic farming benefits. And the market for organic farming worldwide is very huge. So
Okay, thank you very much. Is that going to be a very quick one?
Yes,
Very quick, and then very quick over there, and then we'll start.
My name is Peter Oates. 2 years ago, I spent 7 months in the Ministry of Agriculture in Lusaka, and the politics of, or how do you persuade politicians to change their mind over issues like the subsidies, which in Zambia, I think similar to Malawi, big subsidies for crop inputs, big subsidies for crop purchases, primarily focused on maize. But permanent secretaries and permanent secretaries as well as ministers are political appointees. So in a case like the Ministry of Agriculture there, you have 9 departments with technical people who can't influence really the permanent secretary. So the question is, how at high level, even with a lot of technicians being supported by external researchers and aid donors telling them that the subsidy policies are not the best way to proceed, actually influencing the politicians is terribly difficult, both coming out through the ministry and even also, I'd like to say, at high level, because even if you had ambassadors and foreign diplomats influencing high-level politicians, if they change this policy of subsidies, they will lose the election. So in a way, it boils down to how do you influence the electorate in this situation? Thank you.
Thank you. And very quick. Yeah, have a go.
My name's Sarah Mills. I work with IDE UK. I was just role you see for the private sector in promoting extension services to have broader reach.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for brevity. Right, Colin. Some very quick responses to those to give time for some discussion about land.
Okay, so Julian's question about technology and the links to big business promoting that, and there was also a question about organic farming. I guess where I'm coming from is a position that I do believe that raising productivity for smallholder farmers is a vital issue. That's land productivity and labour productivity, and that new technology is going to be part of that story, that some people will adopt more rapidly than others. Some technologies will be more suitable for some people than others. But that raising particularly the productivity of key staple food crops is a really important issue. My perception is that many countries have not devoted enough attention to this, and often it does in practice get left to donor projects to do something about this. There isn't a drive within national systems. Even if there is a reasonable research culture, there's no way of getting it out there. And so there will be exceptions, but in general I come from a position where I think there needs to be more effort on raising productivity of staple crops rather than less. Should we just go for certifying the existing de facto organic stuff rather than making the effort to actually try and put new inputs in there? My position again is we know we have major problems in quite a lot of soils in Africa now through depletion. Ken Giller and colleagues at Wageningen talk about a gradient where you have a minority of plots which tend to be close to the homesteads, which have been managed well over the years and are fertile, and they still need some maintenance of both chemical fertilizer as well as organic, but they are still fertile soils. You've got some middling soils which are very responsive to inorganic fertilizer because they've been chronically depleted, and you've got a lot of soils which are sort of beyond the pale now unless you get really quite long-term intensive interventions which will essentially be organic in nature. So what we're looking at is a mix of strategies according to plots, even within households, but the aim ultimately is to be raising productivity. If you just go certifying organic, it's very costly to do that, and who is going to pay the premium? We've heard that it's the domestic markets where the really big demand for most of Africa's products is, and they're not going to pay the premiums that would justify the investment in that. Julian, I haven't completely answered your question at all, but Ruth might, and I'll have to move on, I think. Sheila, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name. Pauline, thank you. So your questions were sort of questioning me on why place any store in something like a CADP process at all. And I recognise the basis for your scepticism. Where I'm coming from is not saying that this is some sort of magic bullet. It's saying that my basic analysis in quite a lot of countries is that the domestic political incentives to invest in agriculture sectors is rather weak, and I'm asking, is there anything at the margins that these sort of pan-African initiatives can do? I'm not going to overplay what they can achieve at all, as my analysis of the past 10 years have shown. I fully recognise that where the incentives are weak, you can make a declaration and do nothing about it. That's effectively what the heads of state said in their Malabo declaration, is that many of us did, well, our predecessors, did exactly that on the 2003 declaration. So we're not coming from a position of saying this is going to have a magic effect. At the margins, I do think that there is some value in having commitments that people can question, reasserting them, and giving people the right to say, you know, you've reconfirmed this commitment, what are you doing about it? I do think there is benefit in various forms of information exchange if you can get those key players together, and those who are making progress can talk to the others. Some do have aspirations to do it, they just can't see the way forward. So I do see that. Yes, 10% is a totally political number, and there may be some countries for whom less than 10% is appropriate. In the 1960s, quite a lot of Asian countries were closer to 20% than 10%. So it's not necessarily a crazily high number, it's just a lot higher than it's been so far. It is entirely arbitrary. If we are going to place any store in it beyond just something that's meaningless and empty, then I think we have to have some sense, some way of measuring it, and there will be dangers in that. What it is defined within that 10% is quite important. The easiest way to achieve that 10% over the past decade, evidence shows, is that you have a big subsidy program and you can quite easily hit 10%. Meanwhile, if you have, say, feeder road investment, which many people would argue has a greater long-term benefit, actually it's not counted. So actually those debates about what goes in are quite important, and I think it is important that we do finish the process of saying what goes in and what doesn't. And I think it is good to measure it if we believe at all in gradually deepening democratisation in civil society. They need to have access to information to say, how are we doing on this? There will be problems, however. How do ministries change their mind on subsidies? I'm not sure we've got clear examples on this, although when I was in Ghana recently, I found it quite interesting that it seemed that the Minister of Agriculture was actually, he's a political appointee, he's caught in the middle, but he's the head of a ministry which knows that popular expectations are that something is done on agriculture, and as many people told me, he can clearly see that this is costing him too much and he can't do anything on extension or the things that people expect him to do because his money is going on subsidy. So looking for where there is sort of pushback within the system, I think is interesting. But ultimately, if there are not popular expectations that the government will do something, there's no basis for that pushback. So whoever said, how do you influence the electorate? In the long term, that's where it's going. Extension, private sector, yes. In terms of a purely pay for extension, I think the prospects for that are really limited for the time being. How many farmers are going to do that? Contracting, extension provision to NGOs and private sector and other private sector players, yes. If it's within some sort of vertically coordinated value chain, then actually it can just be delivered by the private sector anyway and collected at the time that the crops are bought. So there are roles for it, but in general, more private sector involvement also then raises interesting questions of coordinating what you're doing, and you're likely only to target the top 5%, maybe 10% of the farming population. So it's not either or, it's at best both and, I think, if you really want to get any depth to who you're reaching.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Ruth, can I ask you to respond to Julian after the next round? So the next round of questions goes to you. So we are running short of time. We have a lot in here. Would you like to? Behind you. The lady, yeah.
Hi, my name is Lois Maragori. I work for GalVmed, which is a global alliance for livestock veterinary medicine. And one of the things that interests me a lot in talks like this is how often agriculture is equated to just crops. Mm. And livestock is completely left out of the picture. So I wanted to ask what outcomes in your talk, Ruth, on large-scale land acquisitions that you see for people who rely on livestock for their livelihoods.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Joseph.
Joe Hanlon. I've just this week published a new book on Mozambique agriculture, and there were two surprises which lead to questions to Ruth. The first surprise was, since independence 40 years ago in Mozambique, there has not been one successful plantation investment. Not one. None make a profit that are new. Sugar, colonial sugar has expanded, but that's the only thing. The question then is, why is there so little research to look at whether any of these big investments work in comparison to other types of investment? Okay. The second thing, second surprise, is digging through the World Bank literature. The World Bank, even in the African savannah, looks at Thailand as an example. And the most important thing about the Thailand model is they prohibit foreign investment in farming. They do not allow any foreign investment in farming. What they do instead is encourage foreign investment elsewhere in the value chain. Has anyone considered the possibility that maybe there isn't much profit to be made in large-scale farming, so we ought to instead leave the farming for people in Africa and encourage foreign investment elsewhere in the value chain?
Okay, thank you. There's a lady here. Yeah.
Just a quickie. Unfortunately, I'd like to just make a quickie in relation to what you just said, Hannah, about leave the rest of the chain to foreign investment. Of course, the rest of the chain in Africa is occupied by women. I'm not advocating. I'm not sitting on an advocacy seat. But I am concerned about that, and we're busy almost forcing women to dig, when in fact they'd rather sell and process. Okay, so that's just that. But I really wanted to make a comment on Ruth. We're worrying all the time about family farms, and we're worrying about women and whether they gain or not in relation to all these different externally driven, if you will, but also sometimes internally driven acquisitions of large areas of land. Is there much work being done at all to assess whether this may be a choice for women to be in a different position? In fact, they're often registering, especially if they're not married. They're allowed to register independently. If they're married, very often they're not. I mean, we have the great old tradition of, the man has to get it if it's a family business. But in fact, women could do it separately as well. They could both be contracted, and that's not done in most cases. But if a woman is a widow or has no spouse at all, she's allowed to actually do that. And I read, when I came to that PLAS meeting, one or two documents that suggested that men very often would rather not cooperate with these plantations and contract farms, because they don't feel they have much to gain. They'd rather go to urban areas, and maybe there's a strong tradition of that historically in Southern Africa anyway, dual homes, one rural, one urban. And then women, on the other hand, have registered. So I wonder if one couldn't talk about it, think about what might be done in a little bit different way, and challenge these ideas that the so-called family farm looks like this neat thing. Everybody's in farming, and the man has the control of women's labour. We know that there's plenty of stories and historical work that's shown that that's not entirely true. There are limits of what any man can call from women, really, I think. So we push this sense that women are quiet and unable to manipulate that relationship and get gains. And I think I'd like to see more of that in this program for research, to try and draw out a somewhat different picture, which I am sure is there. These family farms are not stagnant, and the relationships between men and women are not stagnant either. So I would put more water in your glass.
Right. One gentleman over there with a white... It's a lady, sorry. I just saw the arm. And that's it. I'm afraid we'll have to stop after that.
Well, my name is Esmeralda, and I am a Mozambican smallholder. In Mozambique, most communities still say we prefer to be communist than democratic, because democracy brought Americans to steal our land. I speak as those people's voice, because I grew up in a small community where I was raised up by small farmers. I grew up eating what I produced. But today, I don't have land to cultivate. Why? Because they came in and bought our land from the government. What does the policymakers do about the smallholders, in the sense that they don't actually lose their land because there is industrialization on agriculture? What can make the politicians actually look into internal political policies in order to help those people who do not know how all the policies exist? Sorry about my English. I hope someone understood what I wanted to ask.
I think you asked the key question. Thank you very much. Okay, Ruth, over to you.
Okay, thank you for lots of interesting comments and questions. I'm going to start with Julian's question around the technology push and global interest. And I think this is actually central to the issue of the new alliance. Will this work for the majority of African farmers? Well, I think that firstly we focused on the land issue, and now it seems that actually the big private investment is coming, looking for land, but actually coming in through the value chain. I disagree with Joe's view, which is let people keep the land and uncritically hand over control of the value chain, if that's what you were implying. But I think that with the G8 and the new alliance, the two key things to look at, I think, is what is said in the documents in terms of commitments to smallholder farming versus the actual practice. And if we look at the country investment plans, we see that contrary to a lot of the ideas contained in the original documents, in fact, we're looking at large blocks of land. In the Sagkot in southern Tanzania, tenders are going out for 60,000 hectares at a time. So there's a sort of thinking behind the new alliance, and then there's the practice of it, refracted through this real politics. And I think similarly with the technology push, we'll need to look at what are the implications of all the policy reforms that are being conceded to, including loosening control on seed markets, etc. More generally about why is there this magnetism of large-scale commercial farming? It won't go away. It's another zombie in Africa. And of course, I think there are ideological elements of that, but clearly they're material interests. They're material interests not only for those in government or particular politicians, but at local level as well, for particular intermediaries, interlocutors. And one actually can't talk about how and why certain deals have been concluded without looking at the issue of corruption, which is clearly there in many instances and very hard to understand or to get to grips with. But related to this issue of why is the state consistently pushing this large-scale model, and why are African states doing so when, if you look at all the CADIP documents, it doesn't say we're going to rely on large-scale private investment to come and take over land, but these practices have emerged. And I think that a key issue to look at here is the redistribution of roles between public and private sectors. And most of these deals are coming in on the back of promises that investors will bring infrastructure, investors will build schools and clinics, and build roads and build infrastructure that also might be used for local smallholder farmers. In fact, what we find is that in many instances, some of the sort of corporate social responsibility might be happening, but that investors then are lobbying the state to provide infrastructure, effectively a subsidy, to support their operations. So I think that one has to look in specific cases about who is subsidizing whose functions when it comes to bringing in big private capital that obviously places its own demands on the state. Related to your question, Joe, about the Thailand model, actually a few years ago, Future Agricultures held a very interesting event to debate the Awakening Africa's Sleeping Giant report with its key author, Hans Binswanger. And in that process, in fact, discussed the ways in which the Thailand model is far better for Africa than the Cerrado model, a point which he conceded, but argues that population densities in much of Africa make it unfeasible, and so reverted to the Cerrado. I can't say it as nicely as Steve said, Cerrado. So there we have again this this affinity for large-scale commercial farming. And that's why I think it's important to think about what is it that we're importing when we have these large deals. The Minister of Agriculture in the Congo's response to why they were bringing in South African farmers was, well, you have this big commercial farming sector, so we want one, so we'll bring them and give them the land. Yeah? Hoping that they would bring with them all of the systems and infrastructure and markets and linkages that exist. And they don't, which is why the attrition rate of a lot of these big deals is so high. If you look at the Zimbabweans who went to Mozambique, if you look at the South Africans who went to Congo, which is why perhaps these groupings of commercial farmers are becoming less dominant in the big deals, and rather big multinationals and processing companies that come in with a lot of backing. I realized that one aspect of the story that we haven't really touched on, although I mentioned the growth of financial sector actors, is the purely speculative element of a lot of land deals based on projections of climate change, of growing values of irrigable land in the future. That mustn't be forgotten. Christine, your point is well taken. In the different outgrow models we've seen, there are different ways in which they're structured, and I think that it's in the block farming where people literally merge their land into larger blocks for large-scale cultivation, where there may be less control for women as everybody's contributing their land. But we certainly have seen women contracting individually, but not separately from men on their own land, even though the contracts will affect women's food production on their plots. So I think that's something to look at further. I think we must explore it. But what we've seen is always the issue of widows versus yeah. Yeah.
It's like having blue hair. Yeah. Who live with men, we don't talk about them.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah.
though they're the majority.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's worth looking at.
Yeah.
And also what men expect.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's important also that a lot of the outgrowing that's happening in southern Africa is in sugar, which is very much a male crop. Yeah? So I think that's part of the dynamic. I think that we must look at that.
Sorry, we're going to have, we need to move on.
Okay, we'll chat at lunch. And finally, I want to link Esmeralda's point with the point made previously by Pauline, which was about the importance of land reform processes. Now, I think it's important to say, in the 1990s, there was a proliferation of land reform processes across much of southern and East Africa. And in several countries, that's been stalled. And I think it's important to look at situations like Malawi and Zambia, where effectively governments have stopped short of enacting important tenure reforms that would recognize and give legal credibility to customary ownership as constituting a real property right. And of course, doing so would have tied state hands from transacting that very property. So I think it's very apt. I mean, Esmeralda, you put it very powerfully, that they bought our land from government. And so this is the core issue, that at its heart, you can't even talk about responsible agricultural investment until people own property and are recognized as holders of property rights, not through long and laborious processes of formalization necessarily, but rather recognition of those property rights. Otherwise, the issue with these large-scale land acquisition is that the lessor is the state, not the owner. Thanks.
Okay, well, we haven't done justice to this huge topic, but food beckons. So thank you very much indeed for all the comments from the floor and questions. And thank you to Colin and Ruth for very stimulating presentations. And I hope that discussions will continue over lunch. Thank you very much indeed.